and see. There you go. I think you can see it. Okay. However, the circumstances and events that transpired to place Crispus Attucks at the fore of the colonial mob are much more complex. When he fell dead, newspapers misidentified Attucks as Michael Johnson. However, the mistake was intentional on Attucks' part. Attucks took the alias when he emancipated himself, became a sailor, and escaped to New Providence in the Bahamas. And returning to Boston, Attucks needed to assume the misnomer Michael Johnson because Crispus Attucks had previously appeared in the Boston Gazette, promising a bounty to anyone who could secure his return to slavery. It is ironic that a man remembered as a martyr of American freedom found his freedom beyond American shores. But this reality begs the question, what was Crispus Attucks doing there that night, locked in arms with his former enslavers to protest the oppression of the English monarchy? Spoiler alert, I don't know the answer. But however, it is possible that Attucks and his compatriots believed in the revolutionary rhetoric that they espoused. Attucks's death would be used to unite the colonies as they declared the self-evident truth that all men were created equal. Today's talk will explore some of the reasons why people of African descent and later African Americans took up arms as active and pivotal participants in America's conflicts. We will focus primarily on the Revolutionary War and World War II and assess the motivations, experiences, and outcomes realized by Black combatants. Still, Black America was no monolith, and the reasons why marginalized and targeted groups participated in these conflicts remains complex and multifaceted. For example, although Attucks may have embraced the ideas espoused by colonial leaders, many of those who toiled under America's oppressive system of chattel slavery chafed at the hypocrisy of those who called for freedom while they held others in bondage. Most African-descended people did not see the enslavers George Washington and Thomas Jefferson as liberators. Instead, the great majority of Black people who fought and died in the Revolution did so following the calls of Virginia's Royal Governor Lord Dunmore to take up arms against their American oppressors. Later today, many of us will watch the Super Bowl, and as part of the pomp and circumstances associated with that event, someone will sing the national anthem. But as we recall the rocket's red glare and the bombs that burst into the air, it is essential that we remember all of those who sacrificed, even if the freedom for which they fought has not been yet fully realized. All wars are fought twice. And when the anthem is belted out later before today's game, only the first verse will be sung. However, the often forgotten anthem's third verse complicates the universality of the freedom we hope to profess, because in its declaration that no refuge could save the slave from the grave in the home of the brave, speaks to a very different interpretation of the freedom for which many fought. Therefore, we mustn't remember and celebrate the framing of freedom and sacrifice promulgated by sanitized histories like those that reimagine Crispus Attucks as an American freedom fighter. We must also remember and celebrate those who fought and died for freedom that this nation never intended for them to achieve. More than 2 centuries after Attucks' death on King Street, and shortly after the shocking attack on American forces stationed at Pearl Harbor, James Thompson wrote a letter to the Pittsburgh Courier, the nation's largest Black newspaper, querying, quote, "Should I sacrifice my life to live half American? Will things be better for the next generation in the peace to follow? Would it be demanding too much to demand full citizenship rights in the exchange for sacrificing my life? Is this the kind of America I know worth defending? I can imagine that addicts and many others who waged their lives in the pursuit of freedom wrestled with many of these same questions. Let us now explore some of these stories with our esteemed panelists. Glenn Knoblock is an independent scholar, historian, and author who lives in New Hampshire. Danielle Rose is a volunteer manager of the 10 Million Names Project at American Ancestors in Boston, Massachusetts. And Bob Shepard is a lecturer and the author of Maine's Tuskegee Airmen, A Son's Perspective. I will now welcome Glenn to share his thoughts about the experiences and ramifications of Black participation during the Revolutionary Era.
Thank you very much, Professor Scott. I appreciate it. And I want to thank the Black Heritage Trail for establishing this panel. And I look forward to some of the discussions that result from it. First of all, I want to let everyone know I've been studying New Hampshire's African-American soldiers for the last 25, 30 years now. And it's been my mission to bring their performance, their feats, out of the dusty pages of the records and into the public light. And that's what I continue to do today. It's important to remember that people of color have been fighting for New Hampshire and our nation's freedom, not just since the American Revolution, but really since the early colonial wars. So it's a long-standing history. All of the stuff that you're going to hear from me in the next 10 minutes can be found in my book, Strong and Brave Fellows. I should say everything you hear and much more can be found in that book. So I hope you'll check that out. Let's see if we can get everything working here. I always like to ask people what's missing from this picture. This is an iconic view from the bicentennial back in 1976, for those of us that are old enough to remember that. And nary a person of color appeared in most of the symbolism, the many different iconographic pictures that came out during that day. As a matter of fact, there are still many myths out there about African American service that are haven't yet been dispelled. And these are actually perpetuated by both Black and white historians. I was kind of astounded to read in the 1619 Project, a great book, gives New England not much talk in there, and it says pretty much slavery was over by the time of the American Revolution in northern New England, which is not true. The enslaved were held in bondage in New Hampshire into the 1840s. New Hampshire never officially abolished slavery. I just read another article that talked about the fact that Black men were not allowed from New England states to enlist for service in the American Revolution until 1778, other than a few that had been present at Bunker Hill before George Washington took command of the army. That also is incorrect. As a matter of fact, African American soldiers from New Hampshire, Massachusetts, took part in the conflict from the very beginning, and for New Hampshire especially, in every year that the American Revolution was fought, from the time of Fort William and Mary to the signing of the peace treaty. African American soldiers from New Hampshire were present and doing their mission, their job. It is interesting to note that service was prohibited by both New Hampshire colonial law and George Washington when he took command of the American Army after the Battle of Bunker Hill. As a matter of fact, that old law in the book said that idiots, lunatics, and people of color, as shown up here, were prohibited from serving in militia regiments. However, this law was very much ignored, primarily out of necessity and really the need to raise men to fight against the British, the so-called 88 Battalion Resolve. As I mentioned, General George Washington, upon taking command of the Army, tried to stop all black enlistments. He tried to send all black soldiers home, and said no others could be enlisted. Um, the New England officers and the black soldiers themselves were had some consternation over this, and Washington ultimately said the men that have been enlisted may serve, but no others may be enlisted. And I want to make it very clear this order was ignored by both men trying to join the army and the muster masters in each town who enlisted them. Again, they needed men, and we can talk about the motivations why would a muster master in Portsmouth or Dover or Exeter allow the enlistment of a black soldier? Perhaps it was out of need, but perhaps it was also because they recognized that perhaps here we have someone worthy of participating. And we are going to see in a short while here that George Washington's mind, he never changed his mind about slavery, of course, but when it came to black soldiers, he may have changed his mind a little bit. The background of those black soldiers that served from New Hampshire had a wide variety. Wentworth Cheswell was a man of mixed heritage from Newmarket. His signature at the top there, indicative of his education at Byfield Academy in Massachusetts, rivals that of perhaps a better known signer of the Declaration of Independence, John Hancock. On the other hand, we see in the middle there Caesar Wallace, an illiterate enslaved man, first from Massachusetts, later lived in Rye, New Hampshire. We're going to hear more about him in a minute, too. Michael Sudrick was a free man. We don't know a whole lot about him. He may have been part Native American, practiced the trade of a basket maker. Him and his brother Joseph also served. They were both free men prior to serving. And Ichabod Twilight, same thing, a free man, recently freed, we believe, from Massachusetts, who made his way to New Hampshire. And after the war, he didn't really like what he was seeing in New Hampshire, and he migrated further west to Vermont, where one of his grandsons would be the first African American legislator in the country from a Vermont town. So a wide range of experience from these men. Why did they serve? As Professor Scott mentioned, we don't always have the answers to those, but we can speculate on some of them. First of all, they were patriotic, as we talked about a lot of the rhetoric that was going around. Many of them were fervent believers in that. For those that were enslaved, the chance at gaining your freedom, and that depended entirely on the master, of course. That's another myth of the American Revolution. The enslaved that fought in the American Revolution were automatically given their freedom afterwards if they survived. That is not true. But the chance of freedom was there. Financial reward, especially if they were free, for the bounty, the bonus money that came off of serving. Also, a change in scenery that may have, in many cases, been better than their current living conditions, in their whether enslaved or even on the lowest rung of society in most cases in any given town in New Hampshire. And yes, there is some evidence of coerced service too. And despite this, desertions or disciplinary actions for soldiers of color extremely low. We know of only 2 examples of deserters for New Hampshire's black troops, even though they had ample opportunity to flee the lines and perhaps go to the British side. They didn't do it. So they served honorably and believed in the cause in many cases. I would like to show you a very important document from New Hampshire history. Sadly, it rests in the Massachusetts Historical Society. It's only one of 2 manumission papers for an enslaved person in New Hampshire that I know of. It's very simple. This paper belongs to Cato, late servant, a euphemism for slavery, by the way, to Otis Baker, but now free. And that's June 4th, 1777. 3 days later, he enlisted in the Continental Army, served for 3 years, would later to go on and do another 2-year hitch of service. This document was so important to him, he kept it the rest of his life. He was freed in part because in the town of Dover, Reverend Jeremiah Belknap was an avid abolitionist and preached the hypocrisy of holding people in bondage, why we ourselves are fighting for freedom against the British. And at least several men were freed as a result of that. It's probably no coincidence that this paper ended up in the Massachusetts Historical Society because, after all, it was founded by Jeremiah Belknap, the man who influenced Cato Baker's freedom. How did they assert themselves as soldiers? That's a question I'm often asked. And I say in many cases, it was by being the very best they could be and by demonstrating that they belonged by their actions. We have men like Reuben Roberts, who served 8 years. When he tried to enlist in New Hampshire, he was rejected for service because of his color. Did he go home to Newmarket? He did not. He went just over the Massachusetts border and enlisted in the 6th Massachusetts Regiment, served for a year, came back to New Hampshire, and tried to enlist, and this time was accepted in a New Hampshire regiment. And even later on, he served in the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, a regiment of freed enslaved men in that colony. So this was a man that was determined to serve. Likewise, Jude Hall, who on the eve of the American Revolution had self-emancipated. He had ran away from his master because he was going to be sold, and he was not happy about that. He reached the very far southwest corner of the state, the Monadnock region, when the war broke out. Did Jude Hall keep running? No. He turned around and he enlisted for Continental service. He served 7 years and is one of our most famous soldiers from New Hampshire. We have 3 men on there: Cato Fisk, Caesar Wallace, the man I mentioned previously, and London Daly, who all, at the end of their cumulative years of service, received the Badge of Merit personally from George Washington for their service. Um, George Washington has many, many defects and faults, but he recognized these men for their soldiering abilities. Portsmouth's Prince Whipple, on the other hand, legend tells us that he was promised his freedom if he would serve his master, General William Whipple, one of our signers of the Declaration of Independence. However, he last saw battle service in 1778 at the Battle of Rhode Island. He did not gain his freedom afterwards. So, is it any surprise that he was one of 20 enslaved black men who signed Portsmouth's petition for freedom in 1779, surely making a point to his enslaver? Did it work? Not right away. He wasn't freed until 1785. By the way, 2 of New Hampshire's signers of the Declaration of Independence were enslavers. It's important to remember that. People in the North tend to look to the Southern version of slavery and kind of poo-poo what we had going on in the North. But we have many of our own problems looking at these things ourselves. Professor Scott mentioned that the American Revolution, the fight for freedom, is fought in a couple different places. One on the battlefield, one in the history books. I would add a third place, and that's at home, either before the battle to enlist or to gain some recognition afterwards. Post-war life was not easy for Black veterans. The economy was in a free fall. Many Black veterans and their families were warned out of towns: Portsmouth, Exeter, Dover, who viewed them still, despite their service, as inferior beings. So this is a very disturbing development. Yet, how did they fight back? Long before the NAACP chapter was formed in New Hampshire, we had one veteran, London Daly, personally honored with the Badge of Merit by George Washington, and Rufus Cutler, the son of Tobias Cutler, a Revolutionary War veteran, who sought to organize these men, organize people of color in the state of New Hampshire and advance their goals, if you will. So That's a great way to fight back. And I don't know much about the history of that organization, but the very fact that it was formed in a state like New Hampshire is incredible. And I'll just wrap it up here with one other thing that I like to remind our readers. I think I'm preaching to the choir here, but the revolution was a first and only conflict until the Vietnam War, where black soldiers, at least from the North, served under largely conditions of equality once they made it in the Army. They didn't have separate accommodations, they were given the same weapons, things like that. But as we all know, the revolution was unfinished business. The Civil War would prove that, and we're still fighting that today. So it's not revisionist history to tell that story, nor is it disloyal for teachers to talk about this racism and its impact. It's simply telling the entire story, and that includes New Hampshire, of how people of color have fought for our nation, continue to do so. Thank you very
Thank,
much.
thank you, Glenn, for adding such great context for the pre, post, during experience of Black soldiers from New Hampshire in the Revolutionary War. I want to pass it quickly to Danielle Rose.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here. I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen. Okay. So please just shout out if you cannot see anything. Yeah, so my name is Danielle Rose. I work at American Ancestors, and we are a genealogical organization based in Boston, Massachusetts. So my research has primarily focused on Black patriots who served during the Siege of Boston, which was the opening phase of the war. And this is a map of Boston during that time. It looks a little different. So to kind of orient yourselves, up here is Charlestown. This is the Dorchester area, and then this is Roxbury. So the Charles River does look a little different nowadays. This area has been filled, and this is what's known as like the Back Bay area. So both free and enslaved men of African descent participated in the Siege of Boston from the very beginning, from the Battle of Lexington and Concord in April 1775 to the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775 to the British evacuation from Boston in March 1776. And as the war carried on, thousands of Black men continued to enlist and fight alongside the Patriots' cause. So I'm going to really focus on a Massachusetts-born patriot named Luther Jotham. I've been researching him for several years now, and I believe that his service and his life really exemplifies the complexities of living and surviving in America as a Black veteran. So I know Glenn went over this, so I'm just going to reiterate a little. But, there were different motivations for Black patriots for enlisting in the war. Um, Consistent pay and a promise of bounty land was certainly one of the major ones, because these provided a pathway to financial freedom and equality. Many enslaved men were also promised freedom in exchange for their service. Some were emancipated prior to enlisting. Others were offered freedom under the condition that they complete their service first, and sometimes those promises were fulfilled, and sometimes they were not. There were also some instances where enslaved individuals were forced to serve in place of their enslavers because they wanted to collect the bounty land afterwards. And lastly, racial equality was a large motivation. These men were living in an area where they heard the strong rhetoric around that time of people's inalienable rights and how all men were created equal. And I'm sure that many of these men hoped that these ideas and potential benefits would apply to them after the war. So Luther Jotham was born a free man of color in Massachusetts, and he settled in the town of Bridgewater, where he served as a Minuteman for his local community. Jotham first enlisted in August 1775 after the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he served throughout the majority of the Siege of Boston. So here he is on a muster roll for a Massachusetts-based regiment. And you can see the names of his fellow soldiers, but you can also see that there were other men of color who served alongside him. So the most interesting thing about Luther Jotham's service to me is that he often signed up for short stints at a time. He would serve for a couple months, he'd be released from his service, go back home to Bridgewater, and then he'd sign up again for another few months. A lot of men who served during this time, who signed up for the Continental Army, they would often sign up for long periods of time. So they'd sign up for a year long term, or for a lot of men, mostly a 3-year long term. But again, Jotham only signed up for a few months at a time. Um, and this option really allowed him to receive pay for his service. And it did not force him to commit himself to long terms away from home. But he did participate in the war in other areas other than Boston. He fought in the New York campaign, and his final term of enlistment took him to Rhode Island. So after the war, Jotham returned home to Bridgewater, where he purchased about 15 acres of land. And although his status as a landowner brought him financial independence, it did not make him immune to racial discrimination. So there are two instances that particularly stick out to me um, during his time in Bridgewater. In 1789, the church that Jotham and his family frequented built an indoor balcony for its members of color. And prior to that, all members of this church sat on the same floor in segregated sections, but they were all in the same floor. Um, but this new seating arrangement caused many members, including Jotham, to leave for another church. Later in that same year, Luther Jotham and his brother Calvin, as well as other working class Bridgewater families, um, they received warning out notifications from the town selectmen. And these warning out notifications, they weren't necessarily official eviction notices, um, but they did pressure many people to actually leave town, because it certainly gave an impression that certain people were not welcome in the town and the community. Um, this was really strange for Luther Jotham, because he had lived in Bridgewater for many decades at this point. He had served in the military alongside his fellow community members, and was able to purchase and own land by that point. So to be told that to receive this warning out notification um, is very odd. But he was able to prove that he had financial stability, and he did remain in the town for another few years. So one of the best records that we have for Luther Jotham is his pension record, because it provides testimony from the soldier himself. And from it, we learn that Jotham eventually did leave Massachusetts for Maine, as did many Black residents at the time. But then we also learned that his ability to support himself eventually dwindled over time, despite owning land previously. So he applied for a pension, and early on, Revolutionary War veterans had to prove that they needed financial assistance from the government in order to receive a lifelong pension. That requirement was eventually rescinded. But at the time he applied, he had to provide an inventory of his estate in order to prove that he needed financial assistance. And, you know, although it really helped their cases, the soldiers' cases, the act of describing their poverty was extremely humiliating for these veterans. So this image, it's a page from his pension file, and he describes having only a small hut and house, a few farm animals, and several farming tools. And he mentions that his yearly income is only about $5. Um, and he's not able to really work a lot because of his old age. He's about 66 at this point. So with this information, he was approved to receive his yearly pension. A few years after receiving his pension, Jotham was appointed a legal guardian under the claim that he could no longer take care of himself. This was likely due to his age at the time. And then after a few years after this ruling, he did pass away. So, Luther Jotham's story really demonstrates how many patriots of color who fought under the pretenses of liberty and equality eventually struggled to support themselves after the war. And I just want to end my presentation with this quote from historian abolitionist William Cooper Nell's publication, The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution. This is actually from the foreword written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and I think it really sums up the experience and service of Black patriots. And it reads, in considering the services of the colored patriots of the Revolution, we are to reflect upon them as far more magnanimous, because rendered to a nation which did not acknowledge them as citizens and equals, and in whose interests and prosperity they had less at stake. It was not for their own land they fought, not even for a land which had adopted them, but for a land which had enslaved them, and whose laws, even in freedom, oftener oppressed than protected. Bravery under such circumstances has peculiar beauty and merit. Thank you all.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you for leaving us with that wonderful quote there. We're going to jump ahead almost 200 years as we welcome Bob to give us some more information and contextualization for the experience during World War II. Bob?
Thank you very much, Matt. Let's see if we can get this to. I appreciate being invited to talk a little bit about my dad's experiences of the 1st African American military unit. Bear with me here for a moment. Hold for 1 second. We had some technical issues a little earlier, and I'm going to try to work them out here. Give me just 30 seconds to try to bring this on board. I'm a analog guy in a digital world. Worked in radio for a number of years, and I'm glad to be here, especially to talk about the Tuskegee Airmen. Thanks for your patience. I appreciate that. Again, my dad served in the 1st African American military unit, which is referred to today as the Tuskegee Airmen. I'll refer to them generally as the 332nd Fighter Group. Prior to 1941, as some of the other guests have said in the presentation here, um, blacks have served in every major conflict on the continent: the Revolution, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, and World War I. But one of the major differences is up to that point, their roles are really limited by the regime of discrimination. They could be cooks, they could be waiters, they could be drivers, handle munitions or coal, so the dirty, hard work that no one else wanted to do. In fact, there was a 1925 Department of War study that stated Negroes were unworthy of officer training. They were weak in character, incapable of standing up to the enemy. In reality, though, there was a growing black middle class, men who were college educated, eager to do their patriotic duty. They wanted the right to fight, basically, as officers, like their counterparts who were at Ivy League schools. And with the growing role of aviation in the military world, they wanted to be pilots, and they weren't asking for any special treatment. Now, at that time, civil rights activists were lobbying for blacks to be hired for good paying jobs as factories started to gear up for the war. People like the NAACP and A. Randolph Scott, who was head of the Pullman Porters Union, called for change. Black newspapers across the country created something called the Double Victory Campaign, urging men of color to enlist. There were even targeted efforts to encourage people of color to contribute financially to the war effort as well, with war bond posters. But, and I'm sorry that the PowerPoint isn't participating, but there was an image that I have in there that has a picture of Eleanor Roosevelt, and it ran nationwide in newspapers in 1941. She was on a morale tour of the South, and it really played a significant role in helping to change some of the attitudes. The First Lady, despite the protests of her security team, went up for a ride in a small aircraft with the head of the civilian training program at Tuskegee Institute. Soon afterwards, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed an executive order creating the Tuskegee Army Air Force Training Program. Over the course of the next 3 years, some 15,000 men and women were involved in a number of roles. My father was one of those people. He was born in Harlem to parents who had immigrated in the early 1920s from the West Indies. And he had always dreamed about being a pilot. He would take a train out and watch aircraft at LaGuardia Airport. He was inspired by newsreel images and movies as well. He graduated from a special aeronautics focused magnet high school in 1943. While his classmates, who came from Polish and Italian families, were able to find jobs in a burgeoning civilian airline industry, worked for manufacturers, or in the military after they finished high school, he was repeatedly turned away. When he would go to apply for jobs, they would say, "We already have our quota of Negroes." His first job was assembling toys at a factory on Long Island. Wishing to avoid being drafted into some of those less desirable fields, as soon as he turned 18, my dad signed up to serve, and very soon afterwards was headed to Alabama, where he faced Jim Crow laws and discrimination for the first time, having to walk on the opposite side of the street, sit in the back of the bus, and use separate entrances, something that didn't really have to deal with at that level in New York City. He did his basic training at Tuskegee, and then, because he had 4 years of aeronautical engineering training, was sent for advanced classes in Michigan at Selfridge Air Force Base, before being assigned to a unit that had already deployed overseas. Although there were 13 men who started in the first class of cadets, only 5 earned their wings. That was an unusually high washout rate, and people that I've talked to over the years have said that the white instructors were especially hard on the cadets, and a lot of them scrubbed out of the system for just minor infractions. As a result, the pilots who did make it through were the best of the best. And one of those was a gentleman named Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. He was a West Point graduate. He finished the military academy in 1939. But during his 4 years at that school, he was ostracized by his fellow students. He would eat in the same huge mess hall as everyone else, but he sat at a separate table for breakfast, lunch, and dinner over in the corner of the room. While his classmates had 2, 3, or 4 roommates, he was relegated to basically a janitor's closet that had been converted for his use during the time he was there. Teachers didn't call on him, and he really didn't have a lot of interaction with the students as well, but I think that in some way steeled him and gave him the intestinal fortitude that would come in handy later on in his military career and later on in life as well, as he achieved a number of things. So the unit, which had already begun operating in North Africa and Morocco, was relegated to primarily mundane tasks. The first squadron of Tuskegee Airmen was spent a lot of their time chasing down truck convoys and going after steam locomotives and harassing boats in the Mediterranean Sea. But at the height of the war, the United States Air Force was losing bombers in significant numbers. And I've got a picture in my presentation of a B-17 bomber. Each one of those aircraft has 10 crewmen, and we were losing dozens, if not hundreds of those on some days as forces were coming from the UK and from southern Italy as well. So it became a matter of necessity that we stepped up the number of aircraft that were able to protect them. At the height of the war, Benjamin O. Davis left the command in Italy and came back to the Pentagon and made an impassioned plea to the military brass to redeploy the Tuskegee Airmen to provide fighter escort protection for the bombers as they flew up over Romania and Austria and Germany over enemy targets and flying the missions that they were trained for to begin with. Again, nothing special, and really what the Mustangs were designed to do. That was in July of 1944. My dad spent 18 months living in Italy in a six-man tent. Well, when I was a Boy Scout, he never went to father-dad camporees, and I never figured out until about 15 years later, he revealed that, a year and a half inside of a tent in the heat of the summer and the cold of the winter, and there was no way that he was going to spend another night in a tent, even with his son. He spent time overseas maintaining 4 different aircraft that the 332nd Fighter Unit maintained in all sorts of conditions. He was a good-looking guy. He had olive complexion, long, wavy hair, and speaking a little bit of Italian he picked up on the streets of Manhattan. He was readily adopted by the villagers of the farm towns nearby who referred to him as their long-lost cousin from New York. Now, most of the people affiliated with the Tuskegee program remained stateside during the war for a number of reasons. The bomber crews from the 4 squadrons that were trained to fly B-25s were never found a place in either the Pacific theater or the European theater. Frankly, there were no existing bomber units that would take them on. So they spent most of their time training across the United States. They rose in rank. Most of them, the officers, were lieutenants, lieutenant colonels, and captains in rank. At one point, about 100 of the men were involved in a court-martial in the spring of 1944 in Indiana as they attempted to integrate an officers' club at Freeman Field, where they had every right to be, but the base commander had changed the rules to keep them from participating in that. That was something that stayed on their records until the 1990s when they were exonerated by President Clinton. There were 2 other mass court-martials, by the way, of U.S. Army personnel who were African American during the war. One is at Fort Devens in Massachusetts. The other one was at Port Chicago in California. One of the slides that I like to show, and especially for speaking to a group like this, is of a local person, Wallace Reed, member of a prominent family here in the Portsmouth area. In fact, I found out about it about 6 or 7 months ago, having coffee with an old friend of mine, Sheila Reed, who mentioned her uncle had served as a Tuskegee Airman. And I did some research and found out he graduated from the high school in Portsmouth. He was a smart kid, very technically oriented. He went to the University of New Hampshire where he earned a math degree. And he was in the right place at the right time. Shortly before Pearl Harbor, the War Department estimated it needed 10,000 weather forecasters, but there are only 62 on the payroll. So they put together an accelerated program to train people to be weather forecasters. Wallace Reed found out about it. He took the test. He was accepted and completed the program at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts. On completion of the program, he was sent to Tuskegee, where Wallace helped establish a program to train Black men in the new science. He stayed on after the war and became the first African-American meteorologist to work for the National Weather Service as well. Now, after the war, some of the Tuskegee Airmen chose to stay in the military as their career. Some of them did quite well. My father opted out because he thought that 18 months of experience working in battle conditions would open the doors. But the only job that he could find full-time was working for the United States Postal Service. In fact, when he would interview for jobs, they would tell him that the airlines were unwilling to hire Negro pilots or flight crews or mechanics because if somebody saw them working or flying an aircraft, then they would lose customers. Eventually, he was unrelentless and stuck with it, got a job with Lockheed Aviation as a mechanic and then a flight engineer, and finally worked for 30 years with the Federal Aviation Administration. But I guess we have to remember that the first African American commercial airline pilot was only hired in the mid 1960s. Many of the African American vets that I've had an opportunity to talk to over the last 2 decades doing my research had difficulty taking advantage of the GI Bill, for instance, which provided a path to higher education or assistance with home loans, both of which affect generational wealth. They were fortunately acknowledged later in life with organizations like the Tuskegee Airmen International. During the Bush administration, all of the living Tuskegee Airmen received the Congressional Gold Medal in 2007 at a special ceremony in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. One of the photos that I have includes a gentleman by the name of Harry Stewart, who his name has been on the news quite a bit lately. Harry just passed away on February 2nd at the age of 100. And he was an active speaker and advocate for STEM education, encouraging young people to consider careers in aerospace engineering and the like. He earned a engineering degree after the war was over. Harry shot down 3 German fighters on the same day. But his probably his biggest distinction, and I saw him in Connecticut about a year ago. There was a panel of 5 or 6 guys who were talking about this, and he still was sharp as a whip. He was a pilot on a team of Tuskegee Airmen in 1949 that took part in the U.S. Air Force inaugural weapons competition. So the best of the best pilots from all the different squadrons all over the world from the United States Air Force competed. The Tuskegee Airmen group were flying older piston-driven aircraft against other groups that in some cases were flying jets. They won. They were awarded a trophy that's about 4 feet high, and I've got a great photo of that. Somehow that trophy disappeared. It was missing for about 50 years. It was finally found, and it is now at the U.S. Air Force National Museum in Dayton, Ohio. So the Tuskegee Airmen opened the door to an integrated military, which occurred in 1946 as a direct result of an executive order, almost 2 decades before the Civil Rights Act. They inspired several generations of leaders, people like Colin Powell, Lloyd Austin, Hazel Johnson, and C.Q. Brown. My father and his fellow servicemen and women aimed high, often working twice as hard to rise above their detractors to prove that they could get the job done. And as I think somebody else had mentioned earlier, they fought not one, but 2 wars, one against the Axis powers and the second against discrimination. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. And I know that I express the sentiments of the entire audience when I say thank you to all of the panelists who really added such great context. What I really appreciated most was learning the names, right? Sometimes this history seems so distant because we can't connect, and being able to hear names like Reuben Roberts and Luther Jotham and Wallace Reed really adds humanity to these stories and lets us really understand why people of color, why people of African descent participated in these wars and kind of their experience and what they had hoped to accomplish and what they did accomplish. I know that we are pressed a little bit for time, so we wanted to make sure that we opened it up for questions right away. I believe that the process will be if you raise your hand, somebody will be able to unmute you and that you can put your questions into the chat.
All right, folks. So my name is Lou Butterfield Farrell, and I work for New Hampshire Listens at the Carsey School of Public Policy at the University of New Hampshire. I'm really happy to be with everybody today. Such incredible, rich history. So really thankful to have witnessed that. We just have some community dialogue group agreements that are up on the screen, so you can take a look at those. But we would love for you all to ask your questions. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. I'll call on you and you can ask it, or you can put it in the chat and I can absolutely read that. So does anybody have any questions?
I may ask what's on everybody's mind right now, to Bob, with the Tuskegee, the DEI under attack, and the history of the Tuskegee Airmen being taken out of the training manuals at the Air Force. What do you think that does for our country? And what does it do for the history?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, it's I think it's impossible to erase the history that's already out there. I understand that it seemed like an unforced error. It certainly brought a lot of hell and fury 2 weeks ago when the announcement was made. I can't tell you how many calls and emails we saw from various groups, and it really energized folks, not just in the African American community, but in the military community and folks who are pilots. I think one of the things that I remember both from traveling with Tuskegee Airmen like my dad, when we were in an airport in transit waiting for a van to pick up or connecting flight, and these guys are in their various colored jackets for various chapters of the Tuskegee Airmen International Organization. Grown men and women, pilots, military, and civilian would drop their bags and come running across like they were rock stars and ask for selfies and autographs because and they would share with them how their stories were inspirational and helped them to overcome the challenges and odds that they faced as well.
Thank you.
All right, Susan. Let me just unmute you here.
Hi, I'm curious in this day and age when so much history and civics and everything is being taken out of our high school level and even at the college level, how often any of you get to do these kinds of programs or individual programs within that age group? Because I'm so afraid that all of this information is going to be lost because it's not being presented to our youth at this point in time.
I can speak for myself. Not only do I lecture for the New Hampshire Humanities, and every once in a while we get some younger viewers there at a classroom level. Not so much, although I've been invited to speak to my grandson's classroom later this year, so that's a hopeful note. But I agree with your fears there that once we take this out of the curriculum, this normal part of our history, um, we've already suffered a lot by not teaching it in the past. So removing it once again, so to speak, is going to do some damage. It's leads to ignorance. So it's unfortunate.
I do some work with a organization called the Commemorative Air Force Red Tail Squadron. They're out of Minnesota. They maintain a P-51 Mustang, but they also have a 18-wheeler, a tractor trailer truck that folds out into a movie theater. And they show two documentaries, one on the Tuskegee Airmen and the second on the women air service pilots. And I've volunteered with them in 4 or 5 states where they will go into a community for a week and have middle school kids and high school kids come through the program to get a better understanding. And in some cases, where it's appropriate, they've had people, the original Tuskegee Airmen, while they were still able to be out there, but folks like me who are family members of them as well. And we've been working with them to try and bring them to New Hampshire next year for either something at the Air Museum of New Hampshire in Londonderry or the Air Show in Pease in September. But there are great opportunities, I think, to get this out to a wider group. And I think that most schools seem to be open to kind of an audience type, large audience setting to bring people in and hear about this to add to their curriculum.
Yeah, I think, you know, historical sites are really important at this time, with the attacks at the school curriculum. I actually started doing this research because I was doing an internship with the National Parks of Boston. And a lot of families attend these, the national parks. A lot of students will go on field trips. So I think this is a way to kind of supplement and highlight this work. Um, of course, a lot of these places are federal sites, and I know that there are some fears about defunding there, but it's important to look to other public spaces where we can have these conversations outside of the classroom.
And I shared a link to a curriculum that I've been part of for the last 4 years. I was The reason why I'm here today is I was in this program with Jerry Ann, um, titled Reimagining New England Histories, and there was a multi-pronged program, but one of the pieces was a K-12 curriculum, and we've spent a few years developing lessons that foreground the experiences of Black and Indigenous communities in New England, throughout New England. And this came out of the social justice movement of 2020. The Andrew P. Mellon organization was thinking about, well, how can we address some of the issues that were coming to the fore at that time? And one of the things that our organization said was that if we taught a history that was inclusive, diverse, and celebrated the contributions of all peoples, that people would gain a greater respect and appreciation for the contributions of all communities, and that would change the way that people interacted in the present. So teaching this history and being part of the curriculum is so important. And I just wanted to share that quick link. There's lots of resources, but there's things out there and there's people doing this work. I know that out of the social justice movement, maybe not so much in New Hampshire, but some New England states passed laws that affected curriculum and what groups and communities were included in that curriculum, and a lot of it included the telling of peoples who've been marginalized or traditionally targeted groups.
I would also like to add that if there's any educators on this program who tuned in, reach out to folks like us, whether it's us or people in your community that are telling this history, telling these stories, and I'm sure you'll find some support there. Um, so all is not lost necessarily.
Thanks, everyone. Other questions from folks? Feel free to raise your hand or put those in the chat. Hillary.
Yeah, hi. I was just wondering about how African Americans are doing now with commercial flying with pilots, because as I think about it, I'm not sure I've ever seen, other than primarily white men, not even white women, uh, as pilots on commercial airlines. And I'm just wondering if it hasn't changed at all.
Yeah, that's a good question, Hillary. It's nowhere near where it should be, both in the military and on the civilian side as well. But I think there have been a couple of stories that I've seen in the last year or two of all Black crews that were involved in various missions, both on the military side and the civilian side. We're not where we could be, but I think that we're moving in that direction.
Hey, we had a question come up in the chat, and it says, "Wonderful tea talk as always, Bob. I wonder how has your father's legacy influenced your own life? What has been a meaningful lesson you've carried away?"
My younger brother is a PhD in aeronautical engineering. His first work as a professor was at Tuskegee, and he served for about 12 years as the dean of the School of Engineering at Hampton University. He's still affiliated with the school in a research role at this point. I followed my dad into aviation a bit and working with a company that was a manufacturer of small commercial industrial drones. But as a journalist, knew that his story was one that needed to be retold. Although he would tell us that nobody wanted to hear those old war stories, we kept hounding him until he got to the point where he felt more comfortable making these presentations. And then I co-produced a documentary about 17 years ago, capturing his stories in one place, which we've been able to use in presentations and put up on the internet as well, to share the stories. As Mark said, it's so important to hear the names and the faces and make it real and make it relevant. And as a result of that, have done a number of other projects and continue to do presentations like this, long form in various states as well.
Awesome, thank you. So I see a hand from the number 603-380-0659. So go ahead.
Hi, how you doing? Can you hear me?
We can.
I'm Gloria. I work at the Moffett Ladd House, and I just wanted to mention, of course, Prince Whipple was the enslaved person there to General William Whipple, who lived at the house. So for those interested, we do tell the story of Prince at the house. We welcome you to come and hear it from June to October. We also we have in our files and records his manumission papers from 1784, as well as Cuffy Whipple, who was owned by Joseph. So it is a place locally where you can hear more about Prince, who, of course, did fight in the Revolution, was ultimately given his freedom. And we welcome you to come and hear about that. I just thought I'd mention that. And thanks, everyone, for the great seminar. That's
Thank
it.
you.
And I'm reading your book right now. It's wonderful. The sir who's up there now, whose name I forgot. But I'm reading your book right now, about the brave soldiers. It's a wonderful book.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Susan.
Since Prince Whipple's
I think you're still muted there, Susan.
Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yeah, you got it. You got it.
Okay. Since Prince Whipple's name was mentioned, I just wanted to let people know also, which is she's Prince Whipple's wife, Dinah Chase Whipple, lived during the period of the time, during the Revolution. We have been able to raise enough money. Back in the day, in the 1700s, they didn't necessarily put up headstones for wives. And also, Prince William was buried near William Whipple. And that this spring, hopefully around June 9th, we're actually going to have a celebration and finally put a headstone where she's buried, which we were able to prove was next to Prince Whipple. Which is why I had mentioned earlier about all this history being forgotten, that she's, for those that don't know, she started, if not the first Black American, African American school, she was the second, and the first place would have been in Boston. So, and her school continued after she passed away. So that's why I'm always concerned that all this history is just going to really get lost in the shuffle. So, anybody, it'll be announcement, but she should be remembered for her contributions at this period of time when everybody was living through the revolution and were doing their part whatever way they could. So that's all.
Thank you, Susan. Lou, is it okay if I ask another question?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Danielle, actually, Danielle and Mac and Glenn all talked about the reason why Black African Americans joined the forces and fought in these wars, even in a country that really didn't give them their freedom. How different is that then to today? What kind of connections and comparisons can we draw to our servicemen, in World War II joining up, the Civil War, the Vietnam War, and all of those? What kind of comparisons can we draw?
Well, one thing I'll say, having written both about Civil War veterans for Oxford and Harvard University, as well as writing a story about some of the World War II Black servicemen. The opportunity to enlist was always fraught with challenges. No matter where you were in this country, you were limited. During World War II, for example, if you wanted to enlist in the Army or the Navy, you were going to be limited by what you could do. And you were going to be limited right off by white recruiters who, frankly, did not want to recruit you. I know personally men who were denied entry into World War II service in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor for many specious reasons. Their teeth didn't line up properly, any excuse they could use. And so these types of obstacles to enlistment were always present during those earlier wars. What I like to highlight, though, is the fact that these men were persistent and asserted their right to serve as soldiers and would do so. So that's one thing I can tell you from, let's just say, from World War II back down to the American Revolution. There were always obstacles to enlistment, and yet they found ways to overcome those. And I just want to point out, too, that even though the armed forces were desegregated in 1948 by Harry Truman's order, the practical desegregation of the American military did not take place for many years after that. And of course, in the mindset of officers long in control, in some cases, decades, Black men had to fight for the right to not just serve as mess attendants or, in food service categories, but, to be, whether to be a fighter pilot or to be any higher up rating, if you will. So that order by President Truman was just the very beginning. And it would take many years after that for that to really take practical effect.
Yeah, the thing that stands out to me the most in considering the presentations from the panelists was, or the thing that's most consistent over time I see, is just this, seeing this conflict, these conflicts as opportunity, right? Because the reality is that people from these groups didn't have many opportunities. So that these, conflicts, and I know Danielle and Glenn and Bob all talked about this, there was a financial aspect to it too, right? Obviously, it was about patriotism. Obviously, it was about belonging and asserting that you were, a part of this nation and that you deserve to be treated as such. But also, there was a financial reality, right? That this corded avenue that didn't exist in other ways. And I think that aspect, that financial incentive, is still very much part of it today because of the structural inequalities that we experience in those communities. Sometimes enlisting in the military is a very good option for folks, right? So I think that's still, this opportunity aspect is still very much present.
The other thing I'd like to mention is we just have so many opportunities, and I'm speaking for New Hampshire here, but I'm sure this applies everywhere. We have so many more opportunities to honor these men. When we put up, monuments to soldiers of various conflicts, inevitably, Black men's names are left off these, whether deliberately, certainly deliberately prior to the 1960s, and even today, inadvertently, if you want to call it that. There's so many opportunities. That's one of the things I do. I work with, any town that seeks my advice or help, and how can we honor these guys of the past so that they don't become forgotten? Because if you were to read the period town histories from the 1850s to the 1880s, in most cases, it would be like they didn't exist because, again, these were written by white historians who chose not to recognize that service. So we today can still have a lot of work to do, and especially in the public spaces. So.
Thanks. I just have to make a comment. Mac, you just said that that seeing the conflict as opportunity just kind of reminded me of last Sunday's talk, where one of our presenters said that the African cosmology, the natural way of thinking, was that the human state is conflict, and you need to use that to find the opportunities through those conflicts. So it just kind of just came full force around for me for our talk last week. Thanks.
So I see that we have a question in the chat for Danielle. How did you get interested in the topic of Black patriots and the Revolutionary War? Just curious for several reasons. One is that my 18-year-old is interested in history as a career. How to follow your passion?
That's a really great question. I live in Boston, Massachusetts. I went to school here, and the Revolutionary War history is pretty rich here. And as I mentioned, I did an internship with the National Parks of Boston. My research has always focused on marginalized communities. I really enjoy looking at individuals and their stories and how they really kind of represent the larger historical context, the larger conflicts happening in the world. And so, um, yeah, researching the life of a person is really what I'm interested in, and that's kind of why I do genealogy. Um, but yeah, the question how to follow your passion. Um, I kind of started going to historical sites and museums and really seeing a lot of these stories come to life. We talk about how to keep this these topics in schools and stuff, but I really think that going out and um, seeing these sites is also important, and that's kind of what drew me to history from the very beginning as well. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Danielle. I'm a counter. Go ahead. I see you raising your hand there.
Me?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Go
Hi,
ahead.
I'm Henry Smith. I live in Newmarket, and one of the stars, African American stars in Newmarket, with a plaque in his honor on South Main Street, next to where he's buried, is Wentworth Cheswell, who was mentioned earlier in the program. He did about everything and is renowned here in Newmarket. Wentworth Cheswell.
Thank you.
I would mention Cheswell founded the town library in Newmarket. The Historical Society is based on his collection. He was the first town coroner. Yeah, so he very significant figure, not only in Newmarket history, but in New Hampshire history.
Okay, maybe have one more question here in the chat. Are there any famous incidents of fighting against discrimination by Black soldiers, certainly during World War II, as Black workers and women moved into factories and shipyards, replacing white men? There were many labor actions.
There was a mass court-martial of African-American female nurses in Fort Devens, Massachusetts. They had been college educated and were hired in the Army to serve in a military hospital at Fort Devens, but they were relegated to largely custodial and janitorial duties. And they stood up for themselves and ended up being court-martialed. There was also a situation in California, Port Chicago, a large military munitions depot where trainloads of ammunitions and bombs were coming in and they were being offloaded into supply ships. Most of that work was being done by African American crews. And in the spring or summer of 1944, they had petitioned to the NAACP and other organizations saying we're doing dangerous work without being trained and without adequate equipment, and being pitted against daytime crews, against nighttime crews, working as hard as they could for the officers, the white officers' benefit. There was a huge explosion. It was one of the largest wartime disasters. It was heard as far away as San Francisco. 400 odd men were either killed or injured. About 2 weeks later, as they were cleaning up the site, they tried to get the crews to these Navy sailors to go back into loading the ships once again, and they just flat out refused. And a number of them ended up being court-martialed. They're called the Port Chicago 50. And only recently has the records been cleared, and has there been memorials set up at the exact spot where the disaster was, but also a spot off the base to kind of acknowledge that. And I think this past summer, the Secretary of the Navy acknowledged that a mistake was made, and Thurgood Marshall was then an attorney for the NAACP and came out to defend those sailors in that case as well. So there were several situations where they tried to stand up for their rights.
Thank you. So I'm going to hand it over to Anne Romney to bring us home.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here. I just learned so much, and I have tons of little scribbled notes of things that I want to say. I want to thank everyone for being here. I think what we are learning and what we're able to learn because of the Black Heritage Trail and historic museums and sites becomes ever more important in this time that we're all living through, where there is so much censorship, and there always has been already a history steeped in myth, but that seems to be getting even more entrenched. So I think we have to all really work against that. So these are opportunities to do that. So some of just key takeaways, I'd like to just try to wrap some things up and then cue you up for next week's program. So Black Americans have always served in our military, and they've always had obstacles, and they've always been disrespected or unseen or erased. That all wars are fought twice, even 3 times. So there's the war on the battlefield. There's the war in the history book that doesn't tell the truth that exists. And then there's what they face when they return in terms of discrimination, oppression, still living through Jim Crow back in the day. Questions like, should I sacrifice my life to live half an American life? Not being eligible to take advantage of the GI Bill. That we also know that that's true with the FHA loans, where Black Americans were not welcome after service to get the loans to live in homes, where many white people were taking advantage of that after World War II. But throughout this, people have often fought and pushed forward for the rights that they were entitled to. Let's see, I want to get to the crisp notes here. We've talked about the discrimination, the fact that people faced today, even still, that there is resistance, that people have been motivated to serve for financial objectives, for belonging, for the hope that they would be considered full citizens of this country, and the contradiction of really fighting with your oppressor oftentimes, and facing that same oppression after you have served. So how will our kids, we brought up the topic of what's happening now in our education system. How will our young people learn about this history? Such a critical question. There are some good programs we learned from Bob, that there are some things going on and others that are helping people to learn this education. But we are facing obstacles right now. And I'm actually going to put in the chat, because for those of you that live in New Hampshire, there is a bill that will be heard tomorrow in our house on, it's called House Bill 283, which is a hearing about all of these subjects that are being taken down or proposed to be taken down in our state. And we all have to really push back on this, because we need to keep learning this history. And so much of this happened here in New England, where many of us had no idea of any of the realities of enslavement, of the service, and the erasure. And I loved this idea that we can actually, there are opportunities to honor these people that have served, and that they have often been left out of the ways in which we have acknowledged and honored other white people that have served our country. So I'm so grateful to have had the chance to hear about all of this from all of you, And what a gift it is that we continue to have this type of education. So we do want to actually acknowledge once again that this was made possible today by a grant from the New Hampshire Humanities and others. So we are grateful for that, and we want to keep this coming. Next week, our talk is on the Great Migration, Military Service, and the Shaping of a Diversified New Hampshire, which I think will bring it a little bit closer to home. And we hope that you will join us there. Hopefully we'll be back in person and online next week. That's February 16th at 2 p.m. And I just want to thank everyone for being here today. I learned so much. I'm sure you all did as well. Thank you to the panelists who did an awesome job.
Thank you.
Thank you.